Welcome, friends, for this year's 2014's Universal Brotherhood Day. As many of you are already familiar, it is observed every year for three reasons, to mark three different things. Firstly, the great speech by Swami Vivekananda in 1893 Chicago Parliament of Religions. That also took place on September 11th. In fact, a few days ago, to think of this tragedy on 9/11/2001, that Prime Minister of India sent out a message that there are two 9/11s. One 9/11/1893, which gave the message of universal brotherhood, and then 9/11/2001 as something quite opposite. I will read a little bit from the message that was given by Swami Vivekananda. And I welcome you all. I welcome today's illustrious speakers and the loud music presenters, and all the devotees that have come here. Another reason that we celebrate this day is as a foundation day of the Vedanta Society of Providence. It was also started on September 8, 1928, quite a few years ago. And the third reason is that after the summer break, this marks the opening of our New Year's sessions. So it is the new session, fall session, begins from this day onwards. So that is why to especially underline the main purpose of Vedanta Society, and also to bring together the leaders of various faiths, speaking about some theme that makes an important sense, important meaning to every faith. So this year the theme, as you can see, is religious life at American universities. And all the speakers that we have long connection, ongoing long connection with the universities, and also with various types of religious ideas that they have actually explored, and therefore have a very broad understanding of this concept of religion in connection with the university atmosphere. I will introduce them at the proper time, and I will conclude this introductory speech with the quote from Swami Vivekananda's first speech at the Parliament of Religion. That was, he was replying like all other delegates to the welcome that everybody had received there. And he says there, and I quote, "Sectarianism, bigotry, and its horrible descendant fanaticism have long possessed this beautiful earth. They have filled this earth with violence, drenched it often and often with human blood, destroyed civilization, and sent whole nations to despair. Had it not been for those horrible demons, human society would be far more advanced than it is now. But their time is come, and I fervently hope that the bell that tolled this morning in honor of this convention may be the death knell of all fanaticism, all persecutions with the sword or with the pen, and all uncharitable feelings between persons wending their way to the same goal." So this is the important idea that we try to present through these Universal Brotherhood Day celebrations. And this message has been actually very nicely told, that the whole story of how Swami Vivekananda came here to present this message, it has been described beautifully in a song. And my friends from Anisquam Village Church, where actually Vivekananda gave his first speech in America. His first speech in America was given at the Anisquam Village Church in Massachusetts, a beautiful place, and they had presented this song last year at our service there. So I requested, can they come and do it here this time? And they were very generous and said yes. Kathleen Adams, she is the leader of this wonderful group, so I request her to begin.
Shall
And now we begin the symposium on the religious life at American universities. The first presenter will be my friend, colleague from UMass Dartmouth. She is Rabbi Jacqueline Satlow, a very good speaker. And just a few words about her. She has been appointed now the first full-time director of the UMass Dartmouth Center for Spiritual and Religious Life, and also Center for Jewish Culture. She previously has served as Director of Professional Development for the Bureau of Jewish Education of Rhode Island. She has taught at Brown University, Indiana University, and University of Virginia. So you can see her vast experience as a teacher of religion at different universities. So I request her to begin her talk. After that, after this presentation, there will be a little time for question answers.
So I was happy to have Swami invite me to speak about religious differences on campus. And I have 3 examples that I wanted to concentrate on and then expand on a little bit, and then there'll be time for questions. The first 2 examples are ways that I felt like I've been able to work well and succeed and overcome religious differences on campus while still allowing everybody to maintain their own individuality. And the third is something that's still in process and that we're still working on and haven't figured out the answer to yet. So maybe you can help me. So the 3 examples are awareness of the Jewish holidays, teaching Bible, and proselytizing on campus. So a couple words about the Jewish holidays. As I'm sure many of you are aware, there are significant Jewish holidays throughout the year, and the ones that have been the most significant are Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Passover. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur come in the fall. Passover comes in the spring, and actually in America those holidays, there are many other holidays in the Jewish cycle, but those are still sociologically observed by really quite a number of Jewish faculty and students. And what we found on campus at UMass Dartmouth, there has been really a lack of awareness of the holidays, and it leads to very upsetting experiences for Jewish students and faculty. And that's something that we found that actually just basic education and getting the word out is really, people really don't, this is the kind of thing that gets overlooked rather than people being malicious. And so one of the things that I try and do as the director of the Center for Jewish Culture and the director of the Center for Religion and Spiritual Life is to increase awareness. I'll just give you a couple of examples. So, students who we have, so many students will go home for these holidays, and it comes to my attention when, for example, there'll be an exam, a midterm or something very important that's due on one of those days, and the student and the faculty member might not understand that, this is really beyond, the student is really not trying to just irritate you by missing your midterm exam. This is something really, really important. The student really does need to go home for that day. And so what I try and do about that is to keep publicizing the information really far in advance, and to ask faculty members, please not to schedule exams on those days unless you're willing to give makeups, but really better would be not to have exams on those days. And one of the examples, so a year or 2 ago, Student Services at UMass Dartmouth was doing an anti-drinking campaign. They were trying to convince students not to drink in excess, and they came out with T-shirts, cute little T-shirts about not drinking too much, right? And they decided, and then they pass out T-shirts all around campus, and they want some of us who they think have leadership roles, some people in administration, to wear our T-shirts all on the same day. And what day did they pick? Rosh Hashanah, right? And so, but there's so little awareness that until it came all the way to me. I had someone come to me and ask so I figured when they come to the rabbi and ask her to wear a don't drink shirt on campus on Rosh Hashanah, we're way beyond where cultural religious literacy should be, and I need to talk more with all the people in administration. The fact that got all the way to me, there was so much unawareness in so many different levels. But I would say that this is an example where we've been successful, and that, as I said before, I find that it's really more oversight than maliciousness when that comes out. Although students will come to me and they feel really like it was malicious, and if I can publicize these things in advance, it really helps. The second thing I wanted to talk about, I teach a class it's an introduction to the Hebrew Bible class, introduction to the Old Testament Hebrew Bible. I call it actually the Bible and its influence. And one of the things that happens in that class, students come to that class with such a vastly different outlook from each other. And I try and, what we want is for everybody to be able to hear each other, and what we don't want is for everybody to be yelling at each other in the classroom. So one of the things that we do on this that's been successful is I start the class the very first day, and we go around the room and we say, the Bible is X. Each student says to that out to the rest of the class what the Bible is. And so I have students who say that I have no idea what the Bible is, I've never opened it. And I have students who say the Bible is the literal Word of God and it can't be challenged. And what I want there is for them all to hear each other. I've also had students say, that not only the Bible is the Word of God as it comes through the Catholic Church, so all other interpretations are not valid. So every single thing that comes out, and what I want them is to be able to hear each other so that they are aware before they start talking that not everyone is coming from the same place as them. Okay, I was, I learned a little bit about the Bible in Hebrew school or in CCD, but I really don't feel like I know enough. I mean, there's a real range of answers. So that's helpful. And the other thing that I do in that class is for the students who come from any type of background, I ask them to please bring their own Bibles. And as soon as I started to do that, it was so helpful in the classroom. Now, I have to order something for the bookstore and for many of the students who don't have Bibles. And there's been, the Jewish Publication Society has done a very a very readable translation into American vernacular of the Hebrew Bible. And not that long ago, they came out with something called the Jewish Study Bible that has a lot of academic articles about different Bible topics. So in the bookstore, I order that Bible, but I say to students, please, if you have a Bible at home that you're committed to, bring it to class and we can use your translation. And you can read from your translation. And so one of the first lessons we have to do is on translating the Bible and what is the Hebrew Bible, what is the Old Testament, are they exactly the same, how do the different traditions, the different ways, how does the Catholic tradition understand and use, what translation do they use, the Protestant tradition, other Christian traditions, why is the Jewish translation slightly different, how are they all the same? And but the students especially students who came from very committed religious backgrounds, were much more relaxed from at the beginning when they were able to bring their own Bibles to class. And I were able to be more with me on the discussion right from the beginning. One aside, and this is a story that I love, so one of my students, I think the first year that I taught this class at UMass Dartmouth, who was the most committed to bringing he brought his own Bible that he'd been studying his whole life. And the one thing that I say to them is, bring whatever Bible you want, but there's some articles I really want you to read that are published in the Jewish Study Bible. So if you bring your own, let's ask one of the other students if you can photocopy it. So he always had his own Bible, and we talked about Catholic translations of the Bible and how it arrived and what it is today. And then he decided he wanted to be a priest. And he went for his interview in Boston. And, they're showing him around, and they show him the library. And the first thing he sees right on the shelf is the Jewish Study Bible. So he says, oh my gosh, he said, you have the Jewish Study Bible right on the shelf of the library in the seminary. And the other students said, of course, because it has all these great articles, which is what I had just said in class. So he was much more relaxed, and I used that story as like just an example of some of the ways that differences can be addressed and approached in contemporary America. The third example, the one that I don't really have an answer for yet, is the issue of proselytizing on campus. So we've recently been through a long discussion about what exactly, so because UMass is a state institution, so clergy are not hired by the university, they're paid by their denominations, but we have official affiliates. So what do you need to be, how do we decide who can be an official affiliate and who can't be an official affiliate of the university? And in many things we agree, but one of the things we're coming up, I felt strongly that all of our traditions are equally valid, and that someone who's committed to proselytizing to students, to convincing students to change their religion, to follow him, or her, it could be, is not an appropriate campus minister. And that it's different. I mean, if a student comes to you and wants information about your tradition, please, give them books, or if they ask, you tell them where to go. But that the idea of clergy approaching students to get them to be something different than when they are, I'm not comfortable with that on campus. But there are other clergy who feel equally strongly that this is what we do, that what they do is they want people to accept Jesus, and that the first second that people accept Jesus, then that's their mission, and they want to be able to talk about that all the time, and they feel like I'm intruding into their free speech. To be able to talk with students. They said they can't possibly talk with students without this issue of conversion, because it's right in front of them all the time. So I would leave that as maybe people can give me ideas on, we're at an impasse on agreeing on this particular issue. I'd say that the university administration really doesn't want proselytizing on campus, but I would like it to be like more of a joint, like to come to some type of agreement with that. So I think I spoke a little bit shorter than. I just would say the last thing of program that we're launching this year is a focus on religious literacy, and we are going to have a couple times a semester over cookies and punch. We're going to have a text study from a different tradition, and hoping to bring out the important issues of religious literacy for each religion, each denomination, and in a way to help us speak together. So that should be a way to maintain differences while still understanding each other. So that is a few thoughts on religious differences on campus. Do people have any questions, comments? Yes.
About raising awareness among non-Jews of Jewish holidays. Do you ever invite non-Jews to Jewish celebrations? I'm speaking as a Christian who was married to a Jewish woman for a while. I became very familiar with it.
Well, have I ever? Yes. Is it? Does it happen every year? No. Usually when I've invited non-Jews to Jewish holidays, I've previously, actually I did this, even at Brown, I taught a class on biblical Hebrew, and I taught that same class at Indiana and at Virginia. Well, at Indiana and at Virginia, particularly, a lot of students had never met anyone who was, really had never met anyone who was from a faith tradition different from the one they grew up in. And had never seen, they were studying Hebrew to be able to read the Bible in Hebrew, but they'd never actually seen how it could be read in Hebrew as part of a worship service. So I always, every year, would invite my class and I would go with them to a Saturday morning, a Shabbat morning service, and then I would welcome them, and then so that they can see. I would do it when they were a little bit into it, so that they'd already learned a lot, so that they can follow along, and then they could see how how it's read. I mean, it's interesting for them because they're it goes from right to left. I would talk about that it's read from a scroll, not a book, and so I've done that many years. There'll often be times where so if I have a reason like that, I always do. We do other programs like this year I'm going to teach. I've taught about Passover on campus and like had all the different foods for Passover, or we've had interfaith seders. So everybody who wants to can come on campus and see what a seder is like and and get a chance to sample all the traditional foods, and I'll demonstrate it. It's not I don't always I don't send out emails saying, oh, everybody should go to the synagogue downtown, because it's not. Also, the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the synagogues are very security conscious. So either they have a situation with tickets. It's really, you have to. They're very careful. Unfortunately, they feel like they have to be. So that's not the time to just step in to see what it is. But there are other times that it's nicer to go. To go with somebody, than to just sort of. I mean, you could step in on your own. I think people would be friendly, but it's nicer. Like when I go with I invite my whole class, and then I can ask them to make note of their questions, and then after I can take them all aside, and they can ask all their questions. It works out better if people feel more comfortable.
Well, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes, in the back. Yes, you, sir.
What do you answer people who ask basic questions about the end of the world and all that stuff? Do you just say I'll talk about it later?
I try and tell them I wish I knew the answer. No, I actually teach a class at UMass Dartmouth where this comes up frequently. The class is called Israel and the Religious Imagination, and it has to do with 3 religious traditions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and we look at texts that relate to the land of Israel. And so issues about the end of the world come up, especially in those traditions, and related to the Temple Mount and Jerusalem. And so that class, we do talk about various types of eschatology, issues about the end of the world, and we look at what I try and do is give them a radical and a moderate to read in each faith tradition. So we read the primary sources, and then I try and give them someone, everybody is very interested in what crazy people have to say about religion, and so I give them, I'll usually give them something that's radical, and then I try and give them also something that's moderate, and then we look at different ways, as well as the primary sources, and so we look at different ways that you can understand the same material.
It must be very difficult at times when they come up with profound questions.
Well, if one of the things that's different, I wear 2 hats on campus. One is as a chaplain, and the other is as a classroom teacher. And they're really different. So if questions come up in the classroom about people's own personal faith traditions, then I try and send them to the appropriate chaplain. So that they can talk it through about as far as their own personal beliefs and how they should understand this text, if it's troubling to them. If things come up that in the classroom, we stay more towards Jewish tradition has always said this, here's a verse from the Bible, and here's how Jewish tradition has interpreted it. And a student who will say, well, I'm Jewish and I'm very troubled by it. I'll say, well, if I'm personally troubled. We can talk about the issues, why people might be personally troubled, but if it really has to do with you, I try and bring it out of class, and that's more. And I wear my chaplain's hat more. So that's how I do that. Other questions? There's someone. Yes, first in the back, and then in the pink, you'll be second. Okay.
A kind of question to the classroom teacher in here, right?
Uh-huh.
So does questions like, what's happening right now between Israel and Palestine, and kind of you get a chance to relate it back to the old, the way Judaism.
Right. Okay, well, I'll tell you my very favorite evaluation, at the end of the semester, the students get a chance to evaluate me. And from that class, the first time I taught it, I'll quote to you from my very favorite student evaluation where someone wrote, "I wanted her to tell us who was right in the Arab-Israeli conflict, and she never did. I was very frustrated." So, so I try, what I say in that class is about religion, right? And not about, it'll come up, but, I'll say, well, why, if someone will read something in the newspaper, we'll relate it back to, well, what text did we read? How does this come out of, how does this come out of Christian tradition, right? If someone is, or how does this come out of Jewish tradition, and we'll relate it back to a text. But when they come to me about, what's the answer, I'll tell them that should be in a different class. I don't have, that here we're going to analyze religious views where, and all religious views have a voice, and I don't know, I'm not going to give them the right answer in that class. And it's not a class on contemporary Middle East politics. It's not, it's really about religion. Okay, in the pink, did you have a question?
I just wanted to know if you also approach within Judaism, there are certain different views, and I'm thinking of the Kabbalah tradition, which thanks to Swami Yogatmananda, we are exposed a bit, and whether you explain that approach also in your teachings.
Right. So in the, I always do. One of the things about Judaism, and actually this is about all traditions, and this is one of the things that you learn in religious studies in the classroom, is that there's not one way of understanding. Even in the same tradition, it grows and changes over time, and there have always been different ways of looking at it. So I'll always bring in, because I think the mystical tradition in Judaism is so beautiful, I'll bring in examples, and in the mystical tradition they understand it this way, but there's usually a contrasting position that'll be a more rationalist, and so there'll be different, especially when it comes to stuff about what his question earlier about eschatology and what's going to happen in the world to come. In Jewish mysticism, they spend a lot more time like contemplating and thinking about that whole issue. And there are other aspects of Jewish tradition where they tell you, just you have enough to concentrate on this world. Don't worry about it at all. So, but it's very beautifully drawn out in Kabbalah. And so yes, I do talk about that in the classroom. And I bring in text, too. They read primary sources, although in English. That class is all in English. Other? Yes?
It seems to me with the proselytization that the very method of that approach is antithetical to a university method.
Well, I'm with you on that, but I would like to come to more of a consensus with my colleagues. I remember when I was an undergraduate being in an elevator with someone who really wanted me to join Campus Crusades for Christ, and then when we, as the elevator, and I couldn't get away because I'm in this elevator, and as we were, and I, and I tried to say I'm just really not interested. Like this is someone who they care about it. You don't want to insult them, but like I'm just really not interested. Well, why would you not be? Well, and then you get to, well, I'm Jewish. And then it depends, but sometimes they're like even more excited about getting. So it was like, and I remember this experience really very poorly as like this thing in this elevator. It was so uncomfortable, and so that is sort of where I'm coming from when I'm saying like you just can't. It would be if I showed up at Campus Crusade for Christ and just walked in. They have a flyer on the wall that this is when they meet, and I walked in and I said, "Wow, I'm really so interested in Jesus. Teach me." Well, then okay. That's one thing, but like for someone to come up to me in an elevator where all I said was good morning, like it was too, it was upsetting for me, and that's what I'm trying to separate. I also have come to the conclusion after several years that it's actually college students who come to me who want to change their religions. am more leaning towards just giving them lots of stuff to read and telling them to wait until they're a little bit older and a little more settled in life, and to, once they've read more about the tradition they're interested in, rather than to jump into anything. So I move more towards that. The more college students I meet, who I talk through with these issues, the more that I am getting more comfortable. I always give them, here's what I would suggest that you read about Judaism, if you're interested, but maybe you should wait until you graduate from college and you settle down somewhere. Yes?
Interfaith marriage is pretty common today. Say a Jewish person marrying a Christian or something otherwise also. And so but the question often comes is which one is better or worse and this and that. Does that play any role in your classes? I mean, the students come from different backgrounds and have different traditions and all that, but is sort of influenced by the other half or whatever it is.
Well, I don't think that any of the traditions are better than each other. I mean, I guess my outlook, we're all trying to get to the roof. They're just different ladders, right? So I think my ladder is great. I'm on a great ladder, but I hope that you think that your ladder is great too. So I really don't, I mean, it'll come, like, there might be a verse where I might say, well, I'm not satisfied with my own interpretation of this verse. Let's see how others interpret it. And you might find something else. You might find a Christian scholar who has like a great interpretation of that verse. So I might be, in this verse, he has this great interpretation. But that doesn't, that doesn't mean I put one tradition above the others. And I try and communicate that really strongly with my students, or none, right? I don't have the agenda that students should be more religious by the time they finish my class, right? If they're only intellectually interested, I want them to be, I think that the Bible's really interesting, and so I want to communicate to them that the Bible's really interesting, or any of the other things that I'm teaching, but I don't have the agenda that at the end they'll be more religious than they were at the beginning if they don't want to be. That's also, if their choice is any of the traditions or none, that's still their choice.
Thank you. So that was the last question.
Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi Jackie. It was wonderful, and lot of response through questions that we saw. It was great. Next speaker is Professor Rick Jarrow. He is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Vassar and has a rich background in the world of academia, as well as years of personal in-depth study in Eastern and Western spiritual traditions, mythology, astrology, and shamanism. He is a wonderful writer, has written many books, and conducts a lot of meditational groups spanning different traditions, and works with students very closely, and we are very happy that he agreed to come from that far a distance to this meeting. He will be speaking about the current phrase in the university circle that spiritual but not religious.
First of all, Swami, thank you for inviting me and being so gracious. And Chris, wherever you are, Emily, wherever you are, there's one. Thank you for being here and bringing me here. I think can you hear me? I kind of have a, so I get warmed up. I wanted to kind of unpack this phrase that you hear from Vassar students, and I'm sure from students in colleges all over the United States, if not the world. When you ask them, what is your religion, or what is your, that's a tough, I had, I hope this never happens to you. I went to my high school reunion, and I ran into my high school girlfriend. And the first question, I wasn't, hi, how are you, haven't seen you in 30 years. She just walked right over to me and said, what's your religion? See, you could get in trouble. But if you ask students at a lot of secular universities, what is your religion? You will often get this an answer, and it's not just, oh, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. It's, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. I guess this is, so I want to try to be the mouthpiece for this today. I'm going to take that position for the moment and see if we can get a sense of where this position is coming from and why it may be more than significant. Okay. Number one, there's not one major organized religion, except if you count Quakers, that has been developed in a democracy. Two, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. The next phrase someone might say is that organized religion has been involved in every kind of human indignity and atrocity, from witch burning to caste and classism to racial and gender bias to torture, war, and destruction. That's a fact. Doesn't mean no one else has done it. Okay. Even Zen was hijacked by Japanese nationalists in World War II. And the kamikaze pilots who were, crashing into American aircraft carriers, and the Japanese soldiers who destroyed Nanking were kind of working through a mindset that says, well, the life of the individual doesn't matter anyway. So what does it matter how many we kill or maim or destroy? Whereas in previous times, it wasn't it wasn't the life of the individual, it was the life of a woman or the life of a non-heterosexual person. Doesn't matter anyway. This is all under the umbrella of religion. So then you get in Western history, not the enlightenment of Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha. You get the historical period called the Enlightenment, in which supposedly people got wise to the churches and said, we're done with religion. We want rational thought. I mean, the church couldn't tolerate Galileo, and dragged him to the Vatican and held him under house arrest for the rest of his life. No, we want rational thought. And most of the rational thinkers, not just in the Enlightenment, not just in the 1800s, but in the 1950s, 60s, and even 70s, not just Karl Marx, who said with certainty that religion would wither away, but the United States State Department was absolutely certain when they installed the Shah of Iran that this was the future and that Islamic, quote, fundamentalism was some relic of the past. It really, and they were shocked. They were shocked. They were so shocked that I actually got a scholarship to study Hindi at Columbia because they decided all of a sudden, we better know the Asian and Arabic, just in case. Got me through school. Way back when, what was his name? Alexis de Tocqueville. When he was looking at America, the burgeoning or developing American culture, said, we have to be careful with this democracy because what might appear to be democratic will actually become the tyranny of the marketplace. And indeed, the power of the marketplace has not been lost upon religious institutions. I can't give you the name, but I looked at a study a while back of a church to be. They were developing a church, it can only happen in California, where the very first thing they did was hire a market research firm and just ask, what do people want in a church? Well, people want a place where they can park their car. Seriously, they don't want pews, they want some good music, maybe a place to take care of the kids, and they offered all this, became a mega church. Okay. Religion by the ratings. right? So on one hand, you get this, the secular mantra, religion will just wither away. And on the other hand, it doesn't. Right? In the middle, there are people in the academy who, in my mind, do their best to resuscitate religion in its retrograde sense, in the sense that Marshall McLuhan used to talk about, we're looking through the rearview mirror. You look at the work of a scholar and religious activist like Diana Eck, who's very popular for convening this pluralism project. But if you look at it carefully, what the pluralism project and projects like it are really pushing is religion as denominationalism. That their vision of religion is you have to have a label, Jewish, Christian, Islam, Hindu, that's acceptable. But the fact that, for example, on the two coasts of the United States, New York and San Francisco, that the greatest, arguably most popular emerging religious celebrations don't go under any of those rubrics. Halloween, Burning Man, So one question that, so people who say, well, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual, the general sense is that popular, organized, socialized religion is seen as something that oppresses the human spirit. Now, this is not new, right? About 185 years ago, right around, not far from here, Ralph Waldo Emerson got up as a young man in his first essay, Nature, he says, why should we have a religion of tradition? Why can't we just have a religion of insight in the present moment? And then, and Emerson, he left the church. He even left the university. Here's an interesting thing. I had a wonderful professor. I went to Columbia. I did graduate from college somehow. And he used to say, Emerson left the church. Emerson left the university. And he became Emerson. And I said, wow. It's so cool, become yourself. We don't need anything. But then when I graduated and had to get a job, I said, well, that's very nice, but how did he get paid? How do you get paid for being Emerson? The sociologist Robert Bellah, another kind of, trying to be nice, but retrograde thinker, he condemns in his book Habits of the Heart this type of, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual, as, quote, Sheilaism. He invokes a woman named Sheila, who says, I go to shamanism on Mondays, and I go to my yoga class on Tuesdays, and I go to the church service on Sundays, and this really bothers Bella. In the same way that any of you guys remember the Utne Reader? Yeah, the Utne Reader, still around. Many winters ago, the Utne Reader had a front page article called, quote, Designer Religion. And, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. I'm going to make my own religion, And they asked about 10 different so-called authorities on religion, what do you think of this? And 8 of them said, well, I don't think very much of it because there's not discipline, there's not tradition, there's not a past, there's nothing to measure yourself up against. Things I usually tell students who want to take an independent major. However, when you investigated who these people were, all the people who were against designer religion were people who were personally invested in their positions in religious institutions. What if they gave a war and nobody came? What if they gave a church service and nobody came? Is it the end of the world? I don't know. I don't think so. So the question is, one question is, where is God and where is religion? Emerson says, I go to the woods and I'm become a transparent eyeball. I'm in this this spaciousness, and nobody else is significant. Even my brother I don't even recognize. He says this in his essay, Nature. All right. And someone in the Emerson camp might say, and it might be facetious, but if you think about it, there's a lot of truth to it. If you want ritual, if you want to wear costumes, if you want holy days, you could go to a religious institution, or you could be a baseball fan. Think about it. There's some serious scholarship on the idea that sports has become an American religion. In fact, churches have had to change their schedules because of football Sundays. They have accommodated it. It's called muscular Christianity. What I want to argue here in the few minutes I can is that this question of my spiritual experience versus religious denominationalism is part of a greater issue. And I want to bring our attention to what I consider to be a more encompassing issue that we are dealing with. And I would frame that issue as the individual versus the community. That we are, as a planet, reconfiguring what it means to be an individual and what it means to belong to a group. The ultimate end of individualism, I may argue, was seen, was experienced. I believe it was the either late 60s or early 70s with Fritz Perls, the founder of Gestalt therapy, at Esalen Institute in California, at the very edge of the ocean, no place else to go. And he called it a prayer. The famous Gestalt therapy prayer was, I do my thing and you do your thing. I'm not in this universe to live up to your expectations, and you're not in this universe to live up to mine. Don't hit on me in the elevator with your religion. I do my thing, you do your thing. And then if we happen to meet, it's beautiful. That was the Gestalt therapy prayer, 1970s. In the year 2005, interestingly enough, the then CEO of the same Esalen Institute wrote his doctoral dissertation, published his doctoral dissertation on community. Because the end of individualism, it ended in California in the pursuit of loneliness. Please don't take offense about this. It's not offensive. I'm a member of the tribe, so I can say this is a Jewish joke. You'll get it. Moses and God are in heaven, and it's Yom Kippur. It's the high holy day. And they look down on earth, and they see 4 people playing golf. 3 non-Jews, 1 Jew. Moses is incensed. Says, God, one of my people is playing golf on the highest holy day of the year. Strike him down. God says, all right. Guy hits the ball and gets a hole in 1. Moses is astonished. He says, God, I know your ways are inconceivable, but you've gone too far. How could you do this? And God says to Moses, he says, Moses, think about this. Think about it very carefully. He got a hole in 1, and he can't tell anybody. Think about that. I would argue that what students are redefining is, you go to college, you go out of the nest, and the question is, who am I? But the way, and perhaps, excuse me, I was going to say the only way, we can find out who we are is by asking this very, perhaps even a more difficult question, which is, who do I belong to? Or where do I belong? What community do I feel part of? You know, it's interesting, just as an aside, classical India worked this out in a really interesting way to me, in that on one hand, they had extremely rigid community that you could only belong to in a certain way, caste, class. On the other hand, they have this understanding that there's Atman, and that the Atman, the true self, does not belong to anybody. It's part of the absolute. So, on one hand, the ultimate individual search, I argue, is the pursuit of loneliness. And I don't see our students going there, even though questions like, it's not just, what is my religion that our students are processing? It's, am I going to get married? Is marriage still something, is that a form that can still work? Interesting, I had a colleague teaching Chinese history from Shanghai who, she told me she was 15 years old. She was on the Maoist, what did they call them? Not internment camps, out in the fields, chopping with all the peasants. And she said, I was 15, we're changing the world, we felt so great, no family, this is the new community. And when I went to China with her, she was about 39, I guess. We got to Shanghai. The first thing she did was call her parents. So there's this very challenging dynamic of, in the 70s we had the sects, the religious sects, and in the 40s and 50s you had fascism. They all gave you a sense, you belong. That question is solved. But the question of the individual is dissolved. There is none. I was walking through, right at the end, I was walking through Warsaw, where my ancestors come from, right after the, quote, liberation from whatever they were enslaved by. And I was noticing in all the buildings, they were all gray. And I said, what's the problem? Was it poverty? Was it, lack of color, color awareness? And they said, no, nobody wanted to stand out. Nobody wanted to be noticed, because the next thing you know, police are knocking at your door. So, I see that our students are in this amazing place that I think I see anyway, in my experience, and certainly these are the students who tend to come to my courses. It's a lunatic fringe, but nevertheless, there are a lot of them. That they kind of get, as Mircea Eliade got, the professor of comparative religion in the last generation, that what Eliade called the mythic dimension, what you might call the spiritual dimension or religious dimension, just won't go away. Despite Marx, despite the American State Department, it just won't go away. I went to one of the great sites of pilgrimage in the United States a couple of years ago. I went to Graceland. And I felt like I was, no offense, but the same vibe when I went to Sai Baba of Shirdi. There was this guy who walked out with his two little kids, little daughters, and they were like 4 years old, and he said, "I've been touched by the spirit of the king." Now, when I went to Graceland, I kind of felt a little bit like I was at a WWF thing. Like, I've never gone, but I see it on TV. That's professional wrestling. Like, everybody knows it's fake, but everybody's having fun. Right? I would phrase it a little bit differently. That Richard Rorty, was he a professor of ethics, philosophy at Johns Hopkins? He deals with this in terms of how can we live together in secular culture and each one of us still have our religious identities. And the way he works it out is the radical separation of church and state. You could believe, the end of the world is tomorrow, as long as you don't take it into the marketplace. In the marketplace, it's the dollar that rules. All right? Or I see it a little bit differently. I see that denominationalism that Emersonian sense of personal spirituality is a evolute of the Protestant consciousness of the individual, against all the saints and the ritual and all that kind of stuff. But in fact, when you study, excuse the word, comparative religion, you study other cultures, you find that throughout the world, people have been multi-religious, simultaneously denominational, multilinguistic. I think America might be the only country I know where most people only speak one language. Most people in the world speak 2, 3, 4 languages because you negotiate with different communities. In classical China, you were a Confucian when you went to court or when you went to school. You were a Taoist at a festival, and you were a Buddhist at a funeral. And there was no problem with that. So people who go to their shamanism class on Mondays and yoga on Tuesdays, I kind of see this as incredible progress, because this question, if you're going to be spiritual but not religious, what you're saying is what Carl Jung said in his, was it 1924 essay, Modern Man in Search of a Soul? Jung said, I have nothing against religious denominationalism. I respect the religions. But the people who come to me for therapy, the traditional myths just don't work for them. And I'm trying to give them an alternative. Well, I would argue that as opposed to maybe not just psychotherapy as an alternative, but what we are seeing right in front of our eyes in the colleges themselves and on the streets are the birth of new communities of tolerance, new communities of sharing energy, new communities of spirituality. There was a gentleman in New York, very good friend of mine, he's now in heaven, I guess, or wherever you go, died on Rosh Hashanah. His name was Rabbi Joseph Gelberman, who was once asked to speak at a church. And he was standing there, waiting, and he was feeling very uncomfortable. And he said to himself, Rabbi Gelberman, what are you doing here? And then he just kind of looked up and wherever, he said, Rabbi Jesus, what are you doing here? But it goes beyond that. It's that if your church is baseball, I might personally think that's a pseudo-religion. But I, as a respectful human being, I need to respect your path. Otherwise, all I'm doing is projecting my frustration onto you. I find when it becomes all right with you, it becomes all right with everybody else. There's this beautiful, came to me, a rabbi was talking, this beautiful verse in the Bhagavad Gita, Yehijitamam Prabhajante Tamstataiva Bhajam Yaham, that everybody is following my path in what, and they're getting just what they want. Loose translation. I'll end this discussion with something that the shamanic tradition talks about, because one of the things that is not always spoken of, it hasn't hit the front pages yet, it's in the back pages. In the, like from the 50s to the 80s, we had the meeting of East and West, or maybe from the 1893, if we go back to the Parliament of World Religions. What our brothers and sisters down in Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, what they're talking about now is the meeting of the eagle and the condor, the meeting of the North and the South. That the earth-based shamanic healing traditions that respect plants and animals and community and song in a way that, unless you've seen someone pray over a bucket of water for an hour and a half, it's hard to imagine. They are now integrating with the West and the East and creating a greater gestalt. We are actually seeing the emergence of new communities. And the challenge to me is, can we be open to new forms and welcome them. And, kind of exciting time to be alive, see what emerges. I was at a cathedral in Warsaw. I looked up at the ceiling, the dome, and what do I see? I see all the astrological signs. I didn't know that was part of Christianity. Right? I guess what I'm trying to say is that secularism is not the enemy. There's even Trungpa Rinpoche down at Naropa invented, he called his path, Shambhala, a path of secular enlightenment. Yeah. If it's real, it's going to wear different colors at different times. So I asked my colleague Srivatsa Goswami in Mathura, Vrindavan, India, I challenged him. I said, the avatars of, Krishna is avatar of Vishnu, okay. Do you think Krishna could appear in a business suit? And he said, why not? If he can play a flute, can't he wear a business suit? So that's kind of, but it's, I'm sorry being wordy, that there's one other piece to this that cut around. When students say, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual, it could mean a lot of different things. It could be something well thought out, or it could be post-adolescent angst. Therefore, patience and remembering the words of Mark Twain, where he said, when I was 17, I thought my parents didn't know anything. When I was 20, I couldn't believe how much they'd learned in 3 years. But we might have to take diversity to a whole new level. Because when they speak of diversity right now in the colleges, they're speaking racial and gender, which is fine, but there's so many different kinds of diversity. In India, there's something called bhav. What is your bhav? Which means, what is your spiritual inclination? Are you in bhakti bhav? Are you in jnana bhav? What is your inherent mood? And what if there really is reincarnation? And what if in your past life, I don't know what you were doing, you were a pagan priestess, or you were something, maybe this bhav comes up for you. So I think our challenge is to embrace a diversity that's not just a diversity of class, race, gender, but a diversity of the spirit. That I respect your bhav, you respect mine. But not just if we happen to meet, it's beautiful, because if we don't meet, it's going to be really lonely. So the job is, I see it, creating types of communities that will allow us to meet in respect and high vibration. So, thank you very much. I might have gone over. I know I'm not keeping time, but does anyone have anything they want to?
There's time.
One, yes. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
So I've been looking into transcendentalism lately, actually, and so Emerson, Thoreau, and all those people come up. But the third name that comes up very prominently is a very colorful character, Amos Bronson Alcott.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And so you know about the Fruitland and all that. After that, I was Googling the American religion and all that, and it said AP History of American Religion. Title is 18th Century American Religion and Utopianism.
Okay.
So my question to you is that I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. A lot of people interpret that it's really utopia because you have to hold on to something. A lot of people say, well, I need this practice,
right,
this ritual to be even spiritual. How do you answer that?
I don't. But I'll tell you the image that comes into my mind. The image when you speak that comes into my mind is the Mantri Mandir in Auroville, which is, if you've never seen it, it's a spiritual community founded by Sri Aurobindo Bengali, and the mother, France, by way of Algeria. And this temple looks like a giant golf ball. And inside it, there's absolutely nothing. And the community in Auroville, they started out as a guru-based community, Sri Aurobindo community. But now, if you Google them, speaking about utopian, their mission statement is, quote, divine anarchy. The amazing thing to me is that they're still functioning. And not only are they functioning, but they've changed the climate of that area through reforestation. So for my own thinking, utopianism, like any ideal, can really move you along as long as you understand that you're going to fail. See, Moses understood this, or he got the, you got no choice. You're not making it. But I think that keeps us humble. And the mother didn't say Auroville is the picture community of the future. She said it's an experiment in human consciousness.
Yeah.
Do we have time for one more?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. All right, 1, 2.
Given a spectrum of true yous, of real yous, okay, do you think that each of those real yous is attracted to a different kind of religion or spirituality?
You know something? That's a really good question, and I'll tell you why. Because a lot of, not so much one person in my field in academia, Frederick Smith, but other people studying Taoism, they are beginning to challenge, no offense to anyone, the Advaitic notion that came to the West, that the oneness, absolute oneness of God is the only way to look at things. If you go to places like, what would happen was the scholars and anthropologists, they go to the main temple to, let's say, Shiva, but like a mile back is this shamanic, I don't know what you want to call it, a temple arena with skanda, where 20,000 people are coming at night. So there are some people like Fred Smith in his work on, it's called the self-possessed, spirit possession in Sanskrit literature, and Michael Wynn in Taoism. They're beginning to say that, pose the question, what if multiple selves is not schizophrenia or polytheistic? Maybe that there's a possibility in that multiplicity that we haven't recognized. So there are certain people who are beginning to look at this, look at it this way. And there's a beautiful line in certain Sanskrit philosophies. It goes by different names, but Achinta Bheda Bheda Tattva, which is simultaneously different and non-different, simultaneously one and many. That's kind of makes me feel good. But I just want to bring to your attention, there is work. There is an awareness opening up of that multiplicity has a place on the table. This question of selves and who, that's always iffy, but it might be a party. It might not just be me. Okay? Yes, tell me when the time is up, but yes.
Hi, I have a couple of questions from my husband and myself. Firstly, he asked me to ask you what you think of, or if you've ever heard of this statement that religion is for people that have that are trying not to go to hell, and spirituality is for people that have already been there.
Well, that's funny you asked that, because I once had a confrontation at a marketplace with a born-again proselytizer who said to me, "Aren't you afraid of going to hell? It's mighty hot down there." And I said, well, I actually have been there, so I'm not afraid. But something, it's very interesting to me. Like, we kind of laugh this going to hell, heaven business, it's some antiquated, story. But when you really look into the human psyche, a lot of these stories are still alive. They just take different forms. Like, if I don't get into graduate school, I'm going to hell. It just has a different form. So In my own, which I call a spiritual topography, I like to remind myself, one of the things I constantly tell myself is, it may not be today, it may not be tomorrow, it may not be for a gazillion eternities, but even the devil is going to be redeemed. Or what was it, Charles Schultz, who said, if it's in the end, everything's okay, and if it's not okay, it's not the end.
So that was my husband wanted me to ask
Right.
that, but that's part of my question too, and that, what do you think of 12-step recovery programs, and specifically Alcoholics Anonymous, and their conception of the higher power and turning their will over to a higher power, and that whole dynamic that I feel is sort of tipping the world in this? You hear that a lot. They're spiritual, not religious, and so forth.
I think in this one thing, I once had this nice word, discussion, spirited discussion, I won't say argument, with Robert Bella, who was talking about where's community in America, and everyone's bowling alone and not enough people going to church. And like the Alcoholics Anonymous community, to me, is a great example of an emerging spiritual community. Just like we have emerging, multiple currencies. You have frequent flyer miles, you have dollars, you have Bitcoin. You have the recovery community, in my mind, has really helped thousands of people who could not relate to the traditional religious metaphor. I think it's as legitimate as, and beautiful if it works. And I know people who are, I know Catholics and Buddhists who go to meetings. They don't see it as beneath them or different. It doesn't make me any less a Buddhist. Claude Anshin Thomas, Vietnam War veteran, Buddhist speaker, student of Thich Nhat Hanh. Whenever he comes to speak at Vassar, he always asks me, where's the local meeting? It's very beautiful. But in interest of non-censorship and telling you how I feel, I personally, in my own kind of cosmology, have just one minor, I have my own little issues, but we all do. But in my mind, I don't like to say for myself, I am an alcoholic, or I am this, or I am that, because who I actually am is much greater than that. That's an experience I'm having. And William Blake talked about the conspiracy of the priest and king, that the churches and the governments work very hard to make you feel that you're unworthy and not good enough and you have to do this and that so that you can be controlled. And Blake called it the mind-forged manacles, I hear, that keep our perceptions ensconced in small, itty-bitty thinking, because if we dared to entertain who we really are, then, as my Oreste would say, oh my God. Oh, so I guess I'm in their camp. But to be fair, like 100 years ago or so, William James, America's great religious psychologist, he delineated like two different religious/psychological sensibilities. He called them the sick soul and the healthy soul, not in any value judgment. Tolstoy was a sick soul, and Walt Whitman was a healthy soul. And James said, look, different people have different bhavs, and some people just like, it's all beautiful, and some people need to go through purgatory to get to the light. And and it's just, again, do we have the courage to follow the path that we're given? I think our time is up, but
we are actually running about 20
oh my God! I'll one word answer. I'll give you one word.
Interesting. You said that the Quaker religion was the only religion that sprung out of a democracy, but out of the 6 nations.
I knew you were going to say that. Yes, the Iroquois Confederacy.
Yep, Handsome Lake.
Absolutely.
Started a religion that actually one of the tenets was to abstain from alcohol.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Rick. It was wonderful. Now we will have a little musical interlude. We have a group from Brown doing klezmer music. It is being arranged, organized, and led by our friend Stephen Swartz.
কৃষ্ণ যাদবায় নমো যাদবায় মাধবায় কেশবায় নমো হরি হরায় নম কৃষ্ণ যাদবায় নমো যাদবায় মাধবায় কেশবায় নমো হরি হরায় নম কৃষ্ণ যাদবায় নমো যাদবায় মাধবায় কেশবায় নমো গোপাল গোবিন্দ নাম শ্রী মধুসূদন গিরিধারী গোপীনাথ মদন মোহন গোপাল গোবিন্দ নাম শ্রী মধুসূদন গিরিধারী গোপীনাথ মদন মোহন শ্রী চৈতন্য নিত্যানন্দ অদ্বৈত সীতা হরি গুরু বৈষ্ণব ভাগবতার গীতা আর শ্রী চৈতন্য নিত্যানন্দ অদ্বৈত সীতা হরি গুরু বৈষ্ণব শ্রী ভাগবতার গীতা জয় রূপ সনাতন ভট্ট রঘুনাথ শ্রীজীব গোপাল ভট্ট দাস রঘুনাথ আর জয় রূপ সনাতন ভট্ট রঘুনাথ শ্রীজীব গোপাল ভট্ট দাস রঘুনাথ এই ছয় গোসাইয়ের করি চরণ বন্দন যাহা হইতে বিঘ্ন নাশ অভীষ্ট পুরাণ এই ছয় গোসাইয়ের করি চরণ বন্দন যাহা হইতে বিঘ্ন নাশ অভীষ্ট পুরাণ এই ছয় গোসাই যার তার দাস তা সবার পাদরে মোর পাঞ্চগ্রাস এই ছয় গোসাই যাবে রোজে কইলেন বাস রাধা কৃষ্ণের নিত্য লীলা করিলেন প্রকাশ এই ছয় গোসাই যাবে রোজে কইলেন বাস রাধা কৃষ্ণের নিত্য লীলা করিলেন প্রকাশ তাদের চরণ সেবী ভক্ত শোনে বাস জনমে জনমে মোর এই অভিলাষ তাদের চরণ সেবী ভক্ত শোনে বাস জনমে জনমে মোর এই অভিলাষ মনের আনন্দে বলো হরি ভজ বৃন্দাবন শ্রী গুরু বৈষ্ণব পদে মজাইয়া মন মনের আনন্দে বলো হরি ভজ বৃন্দাবন শ্রী গুরু বৈষ্ণব পদে মজাইয়া মন মনের আনন্দে বলো হরি ভজ বৃন্দাবন শ্রী গুরু বৈষ্ণব পদে মজাইয়া মন বৈষ্ণব ঠাকুর মোর পরম গোসাই গুরু বিনে প্রেম দাতা আর কেহ নাই আরে বৈষ্ণব ঠাকুর মোর করুণার সিন্ধু ইহকালের প্রেম দাতা পরকালের বন্ধু মনের আনন্দে বল হরি ভজ বৃন্দাবন মধুর মধুর বংশী বাজে সেই তো বৃন্দাবন মনের আনন্দে বল হরি ভজ বৃন্দাবন আরে মধুর মধুর বংশী বাজে সেই তো বৃন্দাবন মনের আনন্দে বল হরি ভজ বৃন্দাবন আরে শ্যামকুণ্ড রাধাকুণ্ড গিরি গোবর্ধন মনের আনন্দে বল হরি ভজ বৃন্দাবন ললিতা বিশাখা আদি জাত সখীগণ মনের আনন্দে বল হরি ভজ বৃন্দাবন শ্রীরাম সুদাম সুবলাদি জাত শাখাগণ মনের আনন্দে বল হরি ভজ বৃন্দাবন আর মধুর মধুর বংশী বাজে এই তো বৃন্দাবন মনের আনন্দে বল হরি ভজ বৃন্দাবন শ্যামের বাঁশি বাজিছে ওই শোনো না রে মন মনের আনন্দে বল হরি ভজ বৃন্দাবন আরে রাধা রাধা বলে বাঁশি বাজে অনুক্ষণ মনের আনন্দে বল হরি ভজ বৃন্দাবন শ্রী গুরু বৈষ্ণব পদে মজাইয়া মন মনের আনন্দে বল হরি ভজ ভরে ভাই নাম করে নে বল হরি হরি বল যথা নাম তথা কৃষ্ণ বল হরি হরি বল আরে যথা নাম তথা কৃষ্ণ বল হরি হরি বল হরি বল হরি বল বল হরি হরি বল হরি বল হরি বল বল হরি হরি বল গৌর হরি বল গৌর হরি বল গৌর হরি বল হরি বল সাধের জনম বৃথাই গেল বল হরি হরি বল গৌর হরি বল গৌর হরি বল গৌর হরি বল হরি হরি বল গৌর হরি বল গৌর হরি বল গৌর হরি বল হরি হরি বল হরি বল হরি বল বল হরি হরি বল হরি বল হরি বল বল হরি হরি বল হরি বল হরি বল বল হরি জয় রাধেশ্যাম Who's God, Allah, Jah, Buddha, the Savior? Is there really a creator? Is there really a creator from the infinite infinity? Vedic philosophy, what you meant is all in the land of humanity with so much insanity, too much calamity, separation between church, state, and family. The sun never says to the earth, you own me. Dirt don't discriminate, it's humans only. Bloodstreams are flowing, blue like the ocean. Hot skin and red on every continent, glowing. Aura, our fervor is shining a halo. Chakras are rising, finding our way home. Fork in the road is a turn for the better. Make a choice, live in the now, cause the weather constantly changes and we're evolving. Solving a problem or doors are revolving. Karmic energy follows attention. Free is the action, answer to the question. Which? You was God, Allah, Jah, Buddha, the Savior. Is there really a creator? Is there really a creator? Is there really a creator? Thank you.
Many thanks, all these wonderful musicians. So now, friends, we have another illustrious speaker participating in this great symposium, and he is Father Francis X. Clooney, S.J. He is a Jesuit priest, and he is the Parkman Professor of Divinity at Harvard Divinity School, where he has been teaching since 2005, after teaching 21 years at Boston College. Since 2010, he is director of Harvard Center for the Study of World Religions. He is the author of most recently of Comparative Theology, Deep Learning Process, Deep Learning Across Religious Borders. So, and many other books that he has written, numerous articles, and he is a great friend of Vedanta Society. In fact, when I was talking to Tyagananji, he told, well, you know, actually Clooney knows more Hinduism than I know. So, Father Clooney.
Thank you, Swami. You're most kind. But don't believe a word he says. Swami Tyagananda knows much more than I know. I was thinking how happy the founders of the center from 1928 would be if they could be here tonight. That you come to a strange place, you make a venture, you throw out the seeds, and then you see that in 2014 a wonderful occasion like this comes together, such deep sharing of faith across religious boundaries, such wonderful singing, such wonderful music, such a wonderful occasion. And I think that in itself is a remarkable thing, that World Brotherhood Day here on the campus, here at the center, fulfills a long yearning and a long promise that our pioneers brought out so many years ago. My simple topic for tonight, devotion to one's faith without disrespect for others' faith, might be put more in terms of a kind of mantra or a koan. Devotion to one's own faith without disrespect for others' faith. Or to put it the other way, respect for others' faiths without weakening devotion to one's own faith. That these things are not in competition. There is no reason to imagine that my faith and your faith are somehow at odds, such that if mine is true, yours is not. If I respect my own, I cannot respect yours. But it's far more likely that if I have no respect for my own, I probably will be unable to have respect for yours. Or if I see yours and say, I pick away at it historically, I pick away at it sociologically, I see the problems in your tradition. It's like a boomerang that goes out, and it looks good at first because I found the problems of your faith. And then suddenly it comes back, and it's like that harsh light of the mirror that one looks into, and I begin to realize everything I said about you, with my clueless lack of understanding of faith and tradition, suddenly I see is true of mine as well. And so I think this balance that I think all of us in our own ways tonight are talking about is having a deep respect and love for our multiple traditions really requires of us a deep respect and love of our own tradition, our own upbringing, where we come from as individuals. That in fact, the more we can deepen and nourish and energize the devotion of our own faith tradition, the more we can go back to the basics, back to the charism of the geniuses who in the beginning gave the word, gave the spirit. In today's world, it's that going back, it's that going deep, it's that being very specific that opens us up and enables us to reach and see in all directions. This is easy to say, but I think we have to study it, we have to look into it to imagine how in practice can you say that going deep and being really committed again and again to your own doesn't lead to merely proselytizing, stopping people in the elevator. How does it come that I have such zeal and such love for my own tradition that doesn't simply brush all the others aside? How is this done well? I'd like to simply put before you 3 examples tonight of how we begin to learn about what true devotion is. The intelligence, the clarity, the freedom of being a devout person that isn't chauvinism, that isn't jingos, that isn't pushing this or that opinion, but that the clarity of vision and the kind of deep energy of being a devoted person truly does change things around you. The examples begin with one that is very familiar to you, and I hardly need say anything about it, from the great master. You know the story better than I of Sri Ramakrishna, of his own journey, his spiritual paths, his different sadhanas, the way he found his way through all the different tantras, the way he found his way in Vaishnavism, the way he found his way in Advaita, all the different ways that he took upon himself, that bhav, that bhavana of being deeply within the wisdom that was given. And how again and again he'd come back to the mother, and he'd be there in Dakshineshwar in the temple, and realizing that not only was she allowing him to go on these different paths, but that she was pushing him out. You know, go do this, I'm your mother, find me there as well. And so somewhere in the path of these bhavanas, the sadhanas that he undertook, we know the story about how he realized that if he only stayed with his own faith, the many different Hindu traditions, he'd not gone far enough. And so he realized that that whole thing of Christianity around him, those missionaries, those schools, those hospitals, those preachers who were trying to convert people, on the surface it seems to be pushing back and being hostile in some ways, but if you go deeper and go inside it, you realize that God is there too. And so as we know from the great master, Shambhu Charan Malik began to read to him the stories of the Gospels. We know nothing about which passages were chosen or how often it was done, but it seemed to be a regular practice. Go to the story of Jesus. Read the story of Jesus. Hear about Jesus in the particular. Just as for many years now I've been reading the great master. You go there and you find what the master did. And then there was the picture in the garden of the Madonna, Mary with the baby Jesus. And I can imagine, as in any devout tradition, and certainly in Roman Catholicism, Sri Ramakrishna was simply able to sit with these stories of the Gospels in his mind and see the picture, see the mother and child, see that this mother and this child also revealed the divine to him. And I think what's partly striking about this is that he didn't have a missionary teacher. He didn't go to St. Xavier's on Park Street. He didn't have a guide who was leading him into a Christian church. But out of his own sadhanas, out of his own practice, out of his own sense of his presence of his mother in Dakshineshwar, he intuited the path. There is the Word, there is the story of Jesus, there is Jesus and his mother, and he sort of knew deeply in himself how to do it. And I would say that if he hadn't known, if he had no clue about how to be a Hindu, you might say, he couldn't have discovered Jesus. He had to go deep and say, the way I did it for myself, the way my family has done it, the way we do it at the temple, is the way to go to the other. And so, as you know, again, better than I, he has this final climactic encounter in the garden. He, the son of the mother, he who has come with this great devotion, sees this man walking to him across the garden. And he sort of knows him and doesn't know him because this is outside his tradition, this is outside where he's coming from. But I think he begins to realize that this, in fact, is where my practice has been leading me. All the things that I've done, all the things that I've practiced, all the way up to the Gospels and the Vedanta, suddenly are making this encounter possible. It wasn't by being less of what he had been before, or switching from one faith to another, but rather this encounter was somehow the intensity of going deep into his own. And when he was there, it says in the great master in very simple words, for that period of time as this person was coming to him, he had to push aside in his mind, like into one small corner, everything that was Hindu, all the gods and goddesses were put to the side. And we know it's just for a moment because everything would come back in an even grander form. But in a way, part of the discipline was if you're devout, then it's like that pearl of great price and you cast everything else away. And for this moment in this encounter with this man, the son of the Father who was crossing over the garden, everything else has to be put aside. And then he says, well, who is this? And he says in the great master, he hears an inner voice. There is the Christ who poured out his heart's blood for the redemption of mankind, who suffered agonies for its sake. It is none else but the Master Yogi Jesus, the embodiment of love. These words came from inside him. These words are not gospel words. These words are not of some preacher in Calcutta. But somehow they rose up within him. And what's remarkable about it, that having gone about this his own way, and having found it deep in his own tradition, and realized that by deeper and deeper devotion, it would open the door to this new encounter, he came and heard this voice, which every Christian can recognize without controversy. These are words that every one of us who are Christian or Catholic can recognize. The Christ who poured out his heart for the redemption of the world and mankind, who suffered agony for its sake, the Master Yogi Jesus, the embodiment of love. Of course, he remained Hindu. He remained of his own tradition. The mother gave him this experience and had still more to give him. But I think this theme that we're looking at tonight is going deeper into his own, deeper into devotion, enabled him to come to an insight that for him was transformative and could open the way even for Christians to share the same experience as we see up here today. Later on, there would be controversies. Is Jesus one of the avatars, or Sri Ramakrishna and Jesus two avatars in the same line? And those are all the later theological discussions that come up. And those are fine, and they're unanswerable. But in the heart of it was this moment in the garden, just as they were merging, where he realizes this is the yogi who shed his blood for the world. Second encounter brings us closer to here. Columbia University in the 1930s, perhaps a story less familiar to you, Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton, one of the great religious figures and interreligious figures of the 20th century, in his wonderful book, The Seven-Story Mountain, one of the best-selling spiritual classics of the 20th century, he recounts in this book how he was on a great search, that growing up in a more or less secular family, having troubles in his upbringing, troubles with his mother, troubles with his father, troubles with his girlfriend, troubles with possibly a child that he never really saw. He came to Columbia for his education in literature, but he also came on a spiritual search. And perhaps this is, as Rick was saying earlier, part of this theme today, is that it's not just going to the pilgrimage place, the church, the temple, the shrine, the holy mountain, but that even these great cities and these great centers of learning can be the place where one seeks the meaning of life. And so Merton, in a long section in the middle of the Seven-Story Mountain, talks about going to classes and reading books and talking to different teachers, and everybody kind of giving him advice on what to do. And he's still flailing around. What will I be in my life? And in that situation, he hears from a friend of a friend of a friend that this strange monk is wandering around, Brahmachari. And it turns out that Brahmachari had come too late, mistakenly, after it was over, for a Congress of Religions in Chicago, I think in 1936. He'd been invited, they dithered, they found the money, he came, he got to Chicago, it was over. It turned out that he traveled around, he got a PhD, he did his studies, he went here and there, and came through New York a few times. And Merton was fascinated by this man, this little monk in his robes, his shaved head. And he was fascinated by the fact that Brahmachari seemed to be entirely peaceful in this great chaotic world of New York. And how Brahmachari wasn't coming in judgmentally and saying, this is right, this is wrong, this is like India, this is not like India. But that somehow all of this is interesting and sometimes amusing. He would go to all the churches, the Protestant churches, the Catholic churches. He would see what people do and how they pray. It was remarkable, Merton thought, that he could have such an open mind and yet still represent himself very clearly as of one tradition of Bengal. And so finally, he said he noticed that Brahmachari never gave him advice. He would follow him around, he'd ask him questions and so on. And Brahmachari was always sort of, well, you could do this, you could do that. You know, life is such, you'll find your way, don't worry about it. And finally, he said one day he was amazed when Brahmachari turned to him and said, I do have some advice for you. And this is the passage in the Seven-Story Mountain. He did not generally put his words in the form of advice, but there was one counsel he did give me that is something I will not easily forget. And he said this, in quotes, there are many beautiful mystical books written by Christians. You should read St. Augustine's Confessions and The Imitation of Christ. And this sort of knocked Merton over. He was expecting that finally when the Swami gave him a reading list, it would be the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, Ramayana, and so on. That he would be saying, look, you've obviously found nothing here. Come and read the classics of our tradition. But somehow Brahmachari had this wisdom to realize that when a person is on the spiritual path, giving them something new and exotic and different that is really not their own blood, their own upbringing, their own tradition, may not help them. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. This is the 1930s. And he actually picked very wisely these two books. Thomas à Kempis, you learn so much just from the title. You want to find your way spiritually? You want to know the meaning of life? You want to know where God is leading you? Imitate Christ. And a campus, albeit in a medieval way, with all kind of the ramifications of medieval Christian spirituality, basically says, leave everything, break your ego, let go of your fears, let go of all the things that you're afraid of, let go of all the things you're lusting after, and do as Jesus did. Imitate him. And the more you can imitate Christ here in the 1930s at Columbia University in New York, the more you, Thomas Merton, will find your way. Imitate Christ. You've known about him your whole life. Make yourself another Christ. And the other book, St. Augustine's Confessions, is one of the first great autobiographical works of Western history. And here, Augustine, who wrote so many books on theology, on the city of God, on the Trinity, on the Catechism, on Christ, and everything else, Brahmachari picked out this book because it's the book in which Augustine goes back and tries to remember his very earliest memories and tries to go back to the earliest moments of his life and said, I cannot know my future unless I know the mystery of where I've come from. And not just a glorious mystery or a floating mystery of being a spirit, but rather all the little petty things and all the problems along the way, and stealing those pears in the garden, and having these relationships that don't work out, and having a son, I don't know what to do with my son, and all this stuff of his life. And suddenly, Augustine, finding that he could let go of his materialism, his lack of imagination of the divine, and somehow find his way to God, that all through that, from the beginning, as he says, before I even knew you, before I even longed for you, you were calling for me. And suddenly Augustine realizes everything in my life has been the call of God. And what Brahmachari was doing for Merton was saying, don't go look there, don't go look there, don't go look there, don't think some professor is going to have the answer for you. But go back and read your own life. And if you read your life exactly as it's been given to you from birth, exactly your family, exactly your parents, exactly your earliest memories, that is where God is for you. When you look out, imitate Christ. When you look in, confess who you are. And Merton concludes this section by saying, when I now, and this is years later, when I now look back on those days, it seems to me very probably that one of the very reasons God brought Brahmachari all the way from India was that he might say just that to me. Improbable on one level, but on another level, these great movements of world history and the movements of people everywhere suddenly create on the streets of New York the moment where Merton meets Brahmachari, who says, read the Imitation of Christ in the Confessions. And of course, this opened up, just as Sri Ramakrishna opened up his life and became the beacon of hope that all religions in fact could live in harmony. Merton then found his way back to Christianity, then found his way to the Catholic Church, then found his way to the Trappists, became a monk at Gethsemane in Kentucky, and finally, after many ups and downs in his monastic life and getting involved in all the scenes of the 60s from his monastic place, he found Buddhism, he found the East. And when his life was cut short when he was still young, he was in Bangkok at a meeting with Hindu and Buddhist and Christian monks. But I think somehow it was that chance encounter where, because Brahmachari knew his own faith and respected the faith he had seen deep inside Merton, that the door was opened. And if Brahmachari had no respect for Christianity, he couldn't have changed the life of Merton. Third scene, I suppose, is every campus on which we find ourselves. Perhaps it's here at Brown, perhaps it's at Vassar, perhaps it's at Columbia. But the example I can refer to at the moment is Harvard, where I teach. So on the one side of the campus, Diana X Pluralism Project, the vastness of Harvard Yard and the myriad things that are being done in every possible discipline. And over on my end of the campus, the Divinity School and the Center for the Study of World Religions, where we have people who've been living in this community setting for the last, since 1960 on. People have come and gone, professors and students, over 60 years, all finding their way of how do you balance the study of traditions and being a spiritual person in 1965, 1975, 1985, right now. And the art, and I think everybody knows this, but the art is somehow to say what Sri Ramakrishna did in the 19th century and what Merton found with brahmacharya in the 1930s is precisely what we're being asked to do on our campuses. How do you help people, including yourself, to respect tradition, to know where you're coming from, to believe that God has been present always in your life already, and then to be unafraid of learning from the other? I think over and again in the classroom, in the center, and around the university, we're looking for ways to help people not to be afraid of where they've come from. And I speak in terms of traditions, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu. But as Rick, I think, is telling us, we shouldn't be afraid to imagine the possibilities that our young people actually live in the 21st century, for God is there too. And so how do you go back to where you came from and recognize God there? And the final thing I'll say is that I'm trying this out again in the classroom. We're always trying to do what we say. And I'm teaching a course that I think I talked about a little bit the last time I was here, before this beautiful space was built, Hindu Goddesses and the Virgin Mary. And what I'm trying to do with the 20-plus students in my class is somehow say, can we who live in the West and we who grow up in the Christian Western context, who often have very little understanding of goddesses, can we learn from Sri Lakshmi, from Mahadevi, from the goddesses of the villages of South India, from Kali? Is it possible, without losing our bearings, to learn from these other traditions? And if you have some kind of a Christian background, can you then go back and see Mother Mary again and begin to understand why Mary is so important in Catholic tradition? And if you're Hindu in the class, there are about 3 Hindus in the class, can you begin to realize that all the goddess traditions you've known from your childhood give you this moment when you begin to think about Mary in Catholic tradition? And these things are not opposed to one another. These visions can come together. They're never the same thing. But somehow to see Lakshmi and Mary and Kali and Mary and Mahadevi and Mary, to create a situation in the classroom which is intellectual, academic, lots of reading, lots of writing, and yet opens the portals and the doorways into spiritual experience. I think that's what we want to do and try to do. And I think just finally that I'm very sensitive to Rick's point about not everybody in the class will be simply Hindu or simply Christian. But what happens if somebody comes into my class who says, well, I don't identify with either of those traditions? I would say some version of what Brahmachari said to Thomas Merton, go back into your spiritual biography and find out where you come from. Who are you? And all the details of your life and growing up, what the Spirit has been working. You don't start as Catholic, you don't start as Hindu, then start where you are, and you will find that both the goddesses and Mary can say something to you. Thank you. Yes, please.
So you mentioned Ramakrishna referring to Jesus as the yogi who gave his heart's blood for humanity. And I've always struggled with the idea of crucifixion as atonement. And I just wanted to get your views on that. I mean, there's a standard Christian view that Jesus died for all of us, and there was a kind of a universal atonement. Or is there another way of looking at that?
There are many ways of looking at it, and one of the less desirable ways now is this kind of old sense of it. There's an angry God who needs kind of to have satisfaction for the sins of the world, and only by the victimization of a perfect person can this happen. That kind of bloody image of somehow the Son atones for the sins of the world in a legal sense. I think there are many other ways of thinking about this, but today, strikingly, is the feast of the exaltation of the Holy Cross in Catholic tradition. And it's this sense that, what does it mean that Jesus died on the cross? And the 2 images are given that are among the many. One letter to the Philippians, chapter 2, where Paul says, have in you that mind that Jesus had, who gave up heaven, who gave up being the Son of God, who gave up all of that, and came down so deeply into the human experience that he suffered the worst of deaths. And because he could go into the death of deaths on the cross, he was lifted up and found everything. Be like that yourself. So kind of this moral, spiritual example. And in the gospel reading, Nicodemus, this man who's afraid and comes to Jesus in the night saying, "Don't tell anyone I've come to see you." And Jesus says, all you have to do is be reborn, be born again. And Nicodemus says, I'm too old to be born again, and by that also I'm a learned teacher, and I can't let go of my reputation, and so it's not possible. And Jesus says, but if you begin to see things differently, that we're always going down and always going back up, you can let go. So Nicodemus let go down, and come back up. And then ironically, and this is just the last thing I'll say for now, we never hear of Nicodemus after chapter 3 of the Gospel until the end of chapter 19, when Jesus has died on the cross. And having been afraid for a whole time, Nicodemus comes out of the crowd and says, I want that body, I will bury it with respect. And it's this transformation of the mind and the spirit that I think is closer to what we mean by saying Jesus died and shed his blood for us, but deep in the deepest of human experiences. Yes, please.
Yes. What if you look at your background and you discover you're atheist? Yeah, what if you discover you're atheist?
Well, I mean, I would be candid. I mean, two things I would say. On one level, so what if you look into your background and say, I realize I'm an atheist? On one level, kind of the thinking side of my brain, whichever side that is, I would say, sure. I mean, there are enormous history of theism, atheism, agnosticism, problems with any given philosophy of God, conceptualizations of God that one could have. And sometimes the best way forward is to say, I'm none of that. And say, if that's what you mean by God, that's the theism you're talking about, I let it go. And the things that have been presented to me in my culture, none of that. But the other thing I'd say candidly, I don't think I can't believe that. Now, it may sound colonialist, imperialist, et cetera, but I think that my instinct is to say that there is no human life that does not find in its depth of depth this spiritual, living, divine presence. And that if the only way to get there is by kind of a severe atheism and putting it all aside, then so be it. But that deeper and deeper and deeper down, as you say, I mean, that the world will not end until everyone has been saved. Our conceptions of God may go out the window, but everybody, personally I just believe, my church does too, that going through atheism, you get back to the divine experience. Yes, please.
Basically, I just wanted to quickly thank you, because you brought up that story about the brahmachari. Because he's actually my Gurudev, so his name is Mahanamrata Brahmachari. So the thing is, ever since I grew up, I had this problem about studying science and going into engineering and stuff like that, and studying my own spiritualism or religious beliefs, going deeper into it with the traditions that we were growing up in India. There was always this dichotomy of science versus religion, right? And now what we face is, the deeper you get into your religious beliefs, you keep studying into that, there is a danger of becoming dogmatic.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that in your students, or how do you address that?
I mean, personally, I think, and Swami, you tell me when we're done, so you tell me when the last question comes.
The last question.
Okay. I think dogmatism is a sign that somebody has closed their minds and stopped the process. Doctrine is good, dogma is good, and there are good reasons why communities formulate their faith and say, this is what we believe. But the ever-deepening sense of mystery that the things we say we barely understand, and the things we talk about as if you can just memorize it and recite it, We don't really know that. If we use it as a club to beat somebody over the head, we certainly don't get it. But the dogmatism comes in when I say, okay, now I understand it perfectly, I got it, it's clear, I answer all the questions, I seal things off, and you're wrong, and you're wrong, and you're wrong. But rather the sense of kind of this ongoing quest with the very certainties and truths that God has given, I never understand them well, and I never understand them to the extent where I can't learn from you. And I never learn them in such a way that I only listen to religious people and the scientist has nothing to teach me. But that, I would say, the truly spiritual, the truly devout, the truly faithful, the truly traditional person is the one who can open their mind to everything that is to be learned. Now, you can come up with 1,000 counterexamples, but I think it's because we don't go deep enough in the traditions we claim to belong to that suddenly we have this specter of closed-minded believers. And I think it doesn't have to be that way. And that's why we have universities and schools, is to help people to think beyond where they are already. And Swami said it's enough. Thank you.
Many thanks, Father Clooney. That was wonderful. We have been hearing from the teachers and the professors at the universities, and now we will hear a little bit from one who, as a student at Brown, got into this development of her religious life. And how did it shape? I request Emily Sparks to present that.
Thank you so much. I've been so moved by all the speakers and very humbled by you, so thank you. I think we all have stories about our encounters with spiritual teachers, and so thank you for listening to mine. I'm feeling very emotional. Sorry, I hope I'll get through. It feels very poignant to be sharing my story here on today's topic of religious life at the university, here in this place. Sorry. This is a happy story, I promise. Because it was here in this neighborhood and on these streets where 10 years ago in my life I experienced a bridging of university life and religious life. During my freshman year at Brown, I enrolled in a course on the Hindu experience taught by a professor named Donna Wolf. Her treatment of the sacred texts of Hinduism was careful and reverential and loving. I had enrolled in the class because I was attracted to Indian culture and art and to the pantheon of Hindu gods and goddesses. Growing up, I had been raised by agnostic parents, and our family for a few years had attended a Unitarian church, which I loved. I loved the ecumenical services that drew from many different faith traditions. And I think, at the start of college, my attitude towards religion and spirituality was very much like a guest descending on a potluck, thinking, oh, this looks so tasty, I want to try a little bit of this, I want to try a little bit of that. So, in my freshman year, great, I would love to learn some meditation techniques at the Providence Zen Center. I will go check out a New Age Christian church. That sounds interesting. I will have my images of Ganesha and Saraswati above my desk. So you get the picture. It was sort of a, let me try all of it approach. And that's where I was when I enrolled in Donna Wolf's class on Hinduism. I was interested in sampling, interested in the possibilities for personal transformation and development that I sensed a religious life could provide, but I wasn't quite convinced that walking the path of one religious tradition could hold the answers for me. But one afternoon, Professor Wolf invited the students in her class to meet her here at 227 Angel Street. It was a rainy afternoon, And we huddled, my classmates and I huddled under the awning outside right here of the old blue building and shook the rain off. We came into the old chapel, which was a much narrower, smaller space, and sat in the rows of chairs there. And there were quotations on the wall displaying precepts of many of the world's religions. And this representation of many different faiths reminded me of the Unitarian church that I had attended as a kid, and it made me feel right at home. And then a monk wearing ochre robes and a huge smile entered the room, of course, Swamiji. This was you. And Swamiji and Professor Wolf sat at the front of the chapel, and we had a very casual, informal question and answer session with Swamiji. I didn't ask a question that day, but I did feel very warmed and welcomed by Swamiji and by the others who I met that day. So fast forwarding a couple years down the road, and I was visiting the Vedanta Society regularly for weekly classes, morning meditation, evening meditation. And it's hard to put into words what my relationship to this place has brought to my life since that time, since that encounter. Love, community, inspiration, questions, answers, more questions. And I appreciate my experience at the university, because if it hadn't been for that course that I took, I might never have come in contact with Swamiji and with the Vedanta Society. So I see one role of the university as presenting to students many different paths. The path of a biologist, the path of a writer, the path of an engineer, the path of a teacher. I'm grateful to my college for not just presenting me with the path of academic religious scholarship, but through Donna Wolf and her class, actually bringing me into contact with a vibrant community of spiritual aspirants, which would reorient my life. The university, in my experience, brought me to religion, and that in turn has presented me with a new path. And it's my job now to walk that path. Thank you.
As we see that religion is a matter of experience, not just cogitating or reading about, but matter of tangible experience. So we will have some music about this actual experience. We have two special songs that will be presented. Our friends Maya and Sujata Rege, they have come here at my request to present a very well-known Christian song about feeling the constant presence of God. I come to the garden alone. So I request them to present this, and followed by that will be the rendition of the verses from Bhagavad Gita in its English translation, that how, what kind of person God loves, how one transforms one's life so that we become close to God.
I come to the garden alone, while the dew is still on the roses, and the voice I hear falling on my ear, the Son of God discloses. And he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own. And the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known.
He speaks and the sound of his voice is so sweet, the birds hush their singing, and the melody that he gave to me within my heart is ringing. And he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own. And the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known.
I'd stay in the garden with him, though the night around me be falling, but he bids me go through the voice of woe. His voice to me is calling, and he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own. And the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known. And the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known.
Lifted of all which lives, living himself in us, who looks upon none, yet never scorned, fixed in his faith divine. That man God loved, that man God loved, adamants extend from all ourselves, unchangeable by good of hand, full in his faith, mastering himself, true to his Lord, seeking him heart and soul, thou unto me. That man God loves, that man God loves, who is with friends the same as before, keeping an open heart. Let's good or ill, abide where it will, and where it will depart. That man God loves, that man God loves. Trouble not is kind, and is not vexed by them. Fear of God, free from fear, noble is love. Balanced and serene, pure and unperfect, his praise obey, not moved by it, steadfast in need. That man God loves, that man God loves, that man God loves, that man God loves.
Now I request my close friend and minister at the Vedanta Society at Boston, Swami Tyagananda, to come and give the concluding remarks. Swami Tyagananda is a wonderful speaker, has that very special knack of giving scholastic talks with lot of humor, and he makes them very interesting. So he has a couple of important books to his credit and many innumerable articles. I request him, I always like his presence for this meeting, and I am very thankful that he has agreed to come. Please.
Thank you for inviting me. It's always a great joy to be here. I know we have already shot past the time we're supposed to stop, so I'll keep it very brief. First of all, thank you very much, Rabbi Sattler, Professor Jairo, and Father Clooney, for your presentations, also for the great music. The formal thanks will come later on. Such important ideas surfaced today from the presentations of our three main speakers and also from the questions that were raised. I'm not going to attempt to summarize anything except to just a few brief remarks. Rabbi Sattler, you mentioned about the third unresolved issue you're dealing with in proselytization issues. I think that's the kind of a problem that do come in campuses. At Harvard, we have solved that problem. The chaplains we have, in order to be a member of the Harvard chaplaincy, everyone has to sign a non-proselytization commitment form, that unless they sign it. Now, what that means is that not that they have to, if that's a part of their religious faith, no one is asked to renounce their faith, except that they don't do it on campus. Outside campus, they are free to do and follow, be true to it. But if they want to be a part of campus life, and some of that has worked fine at Harvard, so that's one of the things you could do. But also, in addition, that's a kind of a formal thing, signing a form and all of that. But I think the presentation that Father Clooney made about devotion to one's own faith while respecting other faiths, I think is the soul of what not only life on campus, but also life outside campus would be. And I do think, therefore, that the more this idea becomes known, it will become easier, even within your university campus, to develop a consensus. And one way would be to invite Father Clooney to come and speak to your chaplains group. And I'm sure that will lead to some very good results. Regarding the spiritual but not religious, that was a very interesting presentation. And I have with me some of the survey results about, this is what I read. Well, some polls show that 9 in 10 Americans still maintain belief in God. The trend among young Americans is toward a mishmash of varied religious beliefs. A 2010 USA Today survey revealed that 72% of the nation's young people self-identify as more spiritual than religious. Of those aged 18 to 35, 3 in 10 say they are not affiliated with any religion, while only half are absolutely certain of God's existence. Now, the actual numbers may be very different. As one columnist, Tina Dupoy, observes, it's a very interesting quote, I like it very much. She says, when it comes to self-reporting religious devotion, Americans cannot be trusted. We underestimate our calories, overstate our height, underreport our weight, and when it comes to piety, we lie like a prayer rug. Another survey pointed out that nearly 33% of American adults are religiously unaffiliated. But that doesn't mean they don't believe in God. In fact, 68% do believe in God, 58% feel a deep connection with nature and earth, 37% describe themselves as spiritual but not religious, and 21% admit to daily prayer. Now, I mean, these numbers can vary from time to time, but I think the two terms in tension here are religion and spirituality. And these terms have come up again and again in today's discussion and in also the conversations we might have at other times in other places. In one way would be to think that the two terms should be very closely allied, because it is very difficult to conceive of a religion without spirituality, because religion also deals with the world, it is true, but religious concern for the world is derived in and through its primary engagement with the spirit. Now, if this doesn't sound familiar, try substituting the word God for spirit. Now, if you look at the word spiritual, it includes the word spirit. So how would anyone know anything about spirituality or matters related to spirit without the wisdom derived from religion, either through religious texts or through religious practitioners? What would a religion be if its sole concern was this world and nothing beyond it? Such a religion would be indistinguishable from any social movement, including even atheism or agnosticism. So it's possible to say a strong case can be made that religion and spirituality are synonymous. And yet, that may not be true today, as we can see. Otherwise, this phrase, I'm spiritual but not religious, wouldn't make sense. And a lot of books have come on this very theme, dealing with it. And also, movies. 2 years ago, Jefferson Beck made a film, Why I Hate Religion But Love Jesus. It's available on YouTube, so take a look. It's interesting. What he did was he criticized organized religion as superficial and hypocritical. So there's no denying that the two terms, religion and spirituality, have evolved, and they mean probably something very different today to many people than what they meant maybe a generation or two ago. Now, if most people around us use the terms in a new way, in a different way, it seems pointless or even impractical to continue clinging to older meanings that are rapidly becoming kind of outdated. So what is the new meaning of religion? For increasingly today, religion is getting associated with organized religion. To be religious does not simply mean to have a religious ideal or to observe a religious discipline. To be religious has come to mean being part of a religious group. It has become associated with a membership of a place of worship, acceptance of a dogma, and a commitment to a ritual or practice. Now, this implication is problematic, as it is easy to understand the hesitation to identify oneself as religious. Because as recent decades have shown, religious organizations have not really covered themselves with glory. The media coverage of scandals in religious organizations has pushed into the background whatever good these places of worship do. Many have begun to see religious groups as too concerned with money and power, too focused on rules, and too involved in politics. They have too little of religion and too much of everything else. And there's no surprise, therefore, that it turns off people. Now, there are many theories, as I said. Among the theories of why this group called spiritual but not religious has grown in recent times is that it represents a rejection of the right-leaning conservative politics, or it may be the sign of a changing social and demographic trends, or growing social disengagement and increasing secularization of life. Now, all of these theories have some merit because they are supported by the survey data. But I would like to propose very briefly, very short, one other possibility. And that is, if we, as those of us who are students of Vedanta and familiar with the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna, Holy Mother, and Swamiji, many of us have been kind of trained to see that religion is not simply a system of doctrines, a bunch of beliefs, or a matter of intellectual assent or dissent. Swami Vivekananda once said, religion does not consist in erecting temples or building churches or attending public worship. It is not to be found in books or in words or in lectures or in organizations. Religion is primarily an experience at the deepest core of our being. It is not enough to believe that God exists or that God loves us. Swami Vivekananda said, we must realize God, feel God, see God, talk to God. Close to what we heard the song just now, in the garden. He walks with me, he talks with me. So when religion is seen primarily as an experience, then we begin to look at things differently. The problem with this is that experiences are always subjective. It's impossible to know what's going on in someone else's mind. What we normally end up doing is that we just judge other people by what they are doing. So whether a person is religious or not is not seen on what a person is. I mean, well, how are we to know what a person really is? Most of our judgment of other people about seeing what they do. So when religion becomes something to be done rather than something to be, that's where the problem arises. A person is deemed religious, therefore, because if religion is a matter of doing, then a person is seen religious when doing things that are seen as religious, such as visiting places of worship, praying, meditating, studying sacred texts. Now, when we see someone doing these things, we say that person is religious. But the problem is, what we do is not necessarily always an expression of what we are. Now, if we look in our own lives, it's not often that the inner life of a person is exactly in harmony with the outer life. One of the disciplines that Sri Ramakrishna encouraged people to follow is to bring harmony between our speech, our mind, and our actions. And at present, that harmony doesn't exist. So our inner life may not always be similar to our outer life. Our outer life is what the world sees. They judge us by how things are outside, which is why our basement and our garage looks very different from our living room where we invite our guests, because we try to keep the exterior good. Now, being aware of this discrepancy in one's own life can be disconcerting enough. And we know what we need to do as religious people, as spiritual people. As you can see, I'm using the words interchangeably. But then that's difficult to do. It's so much more easier to focus on what other people are doing, what they do, and what they are perceived to be. Now, it is not unusual to encounter someone who is presented as a religious person doing things that are an antithesis of religion. The process gets multiplied when we see that divergence between being and doing in religious organizations as well. When people and organizations get away with such hypocrisy, it produces anger, frustration, and even disillusionment with religion. And as a result, many people distance themselves from religion as it is seen and acknowledged in today's society. And some of them then may describe themselves as secularists, atheists, humanists, or whatever. But some people cannot bring themselves to doing that. Somewhere deep down within them, the seeds of religious values are deeply embedded. They find themselves in a strange situation. They want to be religious, but are turned off by what goes in the name of religion. Now, the disgust can be so strong in some cases as to pervade the word religion itself. So when the word religion kind of acquires a bad odor around it, that's where the word spirituality comes in. Because spirituality seems like an ideal substitute. It feels neutral, without any baggage with which religion today is burdened. Spirituality is not bound in any organizational structure. It appears free from rules, dogmas, and disciplines imposed from the outside. Most importantly, it is refreshingly free from the need for any commitment to anyone or anything. Being spiritual seems to give us the freedom to choose what we like and reject what we don't like. Now, used intelligently and weaved into an integrated self-discipline, this kind of freedom has the potential to produce good results. But there is also danger. It is just as possible, though, that while the idea of being spiritual is very enticing, very attractive, we may end up doing nothing particular to live spiritually. So we want to be spiritual, but we are not doing anything special to live with those spiritual values. We may have no idea what spirit means, and every fleeting feeling of well-being may be mistaken for a spiritual experience. You see a beautiful sunset, oh, that's so spiritual. You read a great poem, that's so spiritual. I mean, it's not simply using the word spiritual that makes it spiritual. Is it something that makes me transcend my present limitations? So a vague idea of spirituality without any commitment and discipline cannot take us anywhere. That is one possibility that the spiritual but not religious generation have to guard themselves against. And finally, one thought and I'm done. Every one of us can ask ourselves, does it really matter how I identify myself? Great. As religious people or as spiritual people, we might have different ways of identifying oneself, either in terms of our religious identity or as spiritual but not religious, whichever way we identify ourselves. At some point, we have to recognize that it's still a label. Whether I see myself as religious or spiritual or as belonging to this religion or that religion, the truth is that I am what I am. Labels don't matter. So long as I live truthfully, honestly, to what I believe to be right and true, that is what really matters. Because labels ultimately peel away on their own at some point anyway, if I don't do it myself. All these great teachers, the world teachers, incarnations, prophets, saviors, we might identify them with some specific religious tradition. But if you look at their life, they have transcended all these barriers. They belong to the entire humanity. They have crossed all these boundaries. So we cannot limit these great ones within the boundaries of a specific tradition. So what matters, and that's true for all of us, what matters ultimately is who I am as a person, not what others think of me, not how others label me. It really doesn't even matter what I think of myself. What matters is who I am, what my life is. At the end of the day, as many of the Vedanta teachers I've heard have pointed out, many of the elderly monks have pointed out, at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter how many books you have read, or how many retreats you have attended, how many places of worship you have gone to, or how many pilgrimages you have done. At the end of the day, what matters is, what are you? How much unselfish you have become? How true you are to your own values? Am I free from hatred, anger, jealousy, fear, and selfishness? Do I love and help others with no thought of self-interest? If my answer to these questions is yes, then I can go ahead and call myself either spiritual or religious or neither of the two, or call myself by anything. It is results that matter, labels don't. So my gratitude once again to all our speakers, to the musicians for creating this beautiful program, which has been such a wonderful experience. And thank you to Swami Yogatmananda for making it possible. Thank you.
We always end this program with a song that embodies the spirit of this meeting, the song of looking at this harmony in the midst of all variety, and that is this song we call Namaste song.
Namaste, Namaste, I salute the divine in you. In India they say what's so true. I salute the divine in you. You may be from Africa, you may be from Asia, you may be from Australia, but there's something the same in all of us. Namaste, namaste. I salute the divine in you. In India they say what's so true. I salute the divine in you. You may be from America, you may be from Europe, you may be from the islands, but you're something the same in all of us. Namaste, namaste. I salute the divine in you. In India they say what's so true. I salute the divine in you. You may be a Christian, you may be Islamic, you may be Hebraic, but there's something the same in all of us. Namaste, namaste. I salute the divine in you. In India they say what's so true. I salute the divine in you. If you're Native American, Buddhist or Taoist, or if you're a Hindu, there's something the same in all of us. Namaste, namaste. I salute the